It all started on what should have been a quiet Saturday morning. My wife and I were finally enjoying a slow start to the weekend when a loud knock on the door shattered the calm. Standing outside wasn't a neighbor stopping by to say hello, but two police officers called to our home by none other than the HOA president, the same woman everyone in the neighborhood whispered about. People called her Karen because she never missed a chance to flex her authority, whether it was over the color of someone's shutters or the length of their grass. This time, she had gone a step further, accusing my wife of refusing to pay a $2,500 HOA fine. Now, this fine wasn't for anything serious. It was for something petty, the kind of rule no one in their right mind should lose sleep over. But Karen lived for these battles, and calling the cops on us was her way of showing the whole neighborhood who was in charge. What she didn't realize, though, was that she picked the wrong fight and definitely the wrong person to target. Because my wife wasn't just an ordinary homeowner dealing with an HOA. She had years of experience in a profession that Karen could have never seen coming, and when the officers arrived, it was clear this story wasn't going to play out the way Karen imagined. The tension at that moment was almost too thick to breathe. Neighbors peeked through curtains, the cops stood with arms folded, and Karen had that smug look like she had already won. But then, with one calm sentence from my wife, everything shifted. Let's just say Karen didn't know she had basically sworn in the very person she thought she was going to intimidate. And that's where the real story begins. The air was heavy as everyone stood frozen in the driveway. The police officers glanced at each other, clearly trying to figure out why they had even been called out in the first place. My wife stayed calm, her voice steady, but there was something in her tone that made both officers pay close attention. What Karen didn't know was that my wife had spent over a decade working with law enforcement. She had been trained to handle pressure, to read situations, and most importantly, she understood the law in a way that most people never would. Karen, of course, didn't see it. She stood with her clipboard in hand, waving papers around like they were golden tickets. She kept repeating that my wife had broken HOA rules and owed the community $2,500. She made it sound like we were criminals for not bowing down to her demands. The funny thing was, we had never even been given a fair chance to appeal the fine. Karen had pushed it through without a proper vote, claiming she was protecting property values. But to us, it felt more like she was targeting our family, and this call to the police only confirmed it. The officers asked to see the paperwork. My wife let them take a look, and that's when the cracks started showing. Even the officers looked confused. Nothing about the documents screamed legal. It was just whole letters with Karen's signature stamped across them. Meanwhile, neighbors kept peeking out from porches and windows, whispering among themselves, waiting to see how this would unfold. Karen's confidence never wavered, though. She crossed her arms, smirking like she had finally cornered us. But what she didn't realize was that my wife wasn't intimidated, and she hadn't even begun to show her hand. The officers kept flipping through the papers, and you could tell they were trying to stay neutral, but their faces said it all. Something didn't add up. Karen leaned in, almost gloating, pointing to sections of the HOA bylaws like she was reading sacred scripture. She was so sure the officers would march up to us, hand over a citation, and prove her right. But instead, they asked her simple questions: when the fine had been issued, whether the board had approved it, and if she had records of any hearings. That's when her answers started to wobble. The truth was, this wasn't the first time Karen had pulled something like this. Neighbors had warned us when we moved in that she thrived on conflict. Some said she once fined a man for leaving his trash bins out for longer than 6 minutes past the deadline. Another family had nearly moved out after she tried to dictate what kind of flowers they could plant in their front yard. It was almost like Karen treated the HOA as her personal kingdom, and anyone who questioned her authority instantly became her enemy. As the officers pressed for details, Karen's voice grew sharper, louder. She accused us of being problem homeowners, of lowering community standards, of disrespecting the board. But all the while, more neighbors gathered quietly nearby, their arms crossed, their faces tired. You could see in their eyes that this wasn't just about us. This was about years of frustration with a woman who believed rules were meant to be twisted in her favor. My wife stayed calm, but I knew her mind was racing. She had been silent up until now, letting Karen dig her own hole. The officers were still listening, the neighbors were waiting, and Karen was pushing harder than ever. What she didn't know was that the real turning point hadn't even arrived yet. The standoff in the driveway felt like it could snap at any second. The officers shifted uneasily, caught between an HOA president who was practically barking orders and my wife, who stood calm but firm, her arms crossed, as if she knew exactly where this was headed. Karen was relentless, pointing at us, waving her stack of papers, demanding the police do their job. She kept insisting that a $2,500 HOA fine gave her the right to involve law enforcement, and the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. One of the officers finally asked if there was any record of the fine being upheld in a formal hearing. That's when Karen froze for a split second before stammering out an excuse about executive board discretion. My wife raised an eyebrow, and even some of the neighbors let out quiet scoffs. The officers exchanged looks again, clearly realizing they were being dragged into something that wasn't their jurisdiction at all. Still, they stayed patient, letting Karen talk, almost like they were giving her enough rope to tie her own case into knots. But the tension didn't stop there. A few neighbors began stepping closer, emboldened by the fact that the spotlight was finally on Karen. One woman muttered that she had been fined for a fence that was 2 inches too high. Another neighbor whispered about late fees that seemed to appear out of nowhere. You could feel a shift in the crowd. What started as Karen trying to shame us had turned into a neighborhood quietly rallying against her. Karen, though, refused to back down. Her voice rose, her face flushed red, and she jabbed her finger toward my wife like she was issuing a final warning. Everyone fell silent, waiting for my wife to respond. And in that breathless pause, you could feel it. Something was about to break wide open. Before my wife could even answer, one of the officers cleared his throat and said something that made the whole crowd lean in. He explained that the police department had actually received more than one complaint about HOA disputes in this neighborhood, all connected back to Karen's name. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. You could almost see the color drain from Karen's face, but she quickly tried to cover it by talking over him, insisting those were just troublemakers who didn't respect community rules. But the officer didn't back down. He mentioned that the city was already reviewing certain HOA practices in our area after repeated calls, and now with this $2,500 fine and a police response that felt unnecessary, things might move faster. That revelation changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just about us refusing to pay a fine. It had the potential to put Karen's entire reign as HOA president under the microscope. The neighbors who had been whispering now looked at one another with wide eyes, some nodding as if they finally felt validated. Karen's voice grew shrill as she tried to regain control. She accused the officers of being biased and the neighbors of ganging up on her. But the louder she got, the clearer it became that she was losing ground. My wife still hadn't spoken more than a few calm words, yet the tide was shifting all around us. She finally glanced at me, then back at the officers, her expression unreadable. But I knew that look. It meant she was about to step in. The crowd fell into a heavy silence again. The stakes were no longer just about one family's fine. The question now was whether Karen's entire system of control was about to collapse, and my wife was holding the one card that could tip it all. My wife finally stepped forward, her calm presence cutting through the chaos. She reached into her bag and pulled out her badge. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's smirk vanished instantly as my wife introduced herself, not as just another homeowner, but as someone who had spent years working directly with law enforcement, someone sworn to uphold the law, not bend to petty HOA rules. The officers straightened immediately, their respect obvious, while the neighbors leaned in, stunned by the reveal. Karen tried to laugh it off, claiming my wife was bluffing, but the badge in her hand spoke louder than words. My wife explained, carefully and firmly, that the HOA fine wasn't legally enforceable through police action, and that Karen had abused her position by escalating the matter. She broke down how HOA bylaws worked, pointing out that Karen had skipped the required hearings and bypassed the board. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about every neighbor she had intimidated with false threats and overblown fines. The crowd stirred, murmurs turning into voices, each neighbor finding courage in the moment. The officers finally stepped in, warning Karen that misusing police resources could itself become an issue. For the first time, Karen's confidence cracked. She sputtered, clutching her papers, realizing the power she thought she had was slipping away. Just when it felt like the final blow had landed, the unexpected twist came. One of the neighbors, an older gentleman who had been quiet until now, spoke up. He revealed that he had already filed a formal complaint with the state against Karen and the HOA weeks earlier. And with what had just happened in plain sight, he promised he'd be adding this incident as fresh evidence. The look on Karen's face said it all. The kingdom she had built on fear was collapsing, and everyone was watching it happen in real time. The tension finally eased as the officers closed their notepads and told Karen there was nothing more they could do for her complaint. It was clear to everyone that the $2,500 HOA fine she tried to enforce had no legal ground. The neighbors, once silent and cautious, began speaking more openly. They shared their stories: fines for garden decorations, threats over mailbox colors, and letters that felt more like personal vendettas than community rules. What started as our battle suddenly felt like a collective stand against years of unfair treatment. Karen stormed off, clutching her stack of papers, but the power she once held was gone. Within weeks, a group of neighbors petitioned for a special home meeting. For the first time, people weren't afraid to speak up. My wife, with her calm authority, explained to everyone how HOA bylaws should actually be applied, how transparency mattered, and why checks and balances were important. It wasn't about tearing the HOA apart. It was about rebuilding trust and making sure it served the community, not one person's ego. The petition passed, and Karen was eventually voted out of her position. The board was reshaped with new members who promised fairness and accountability. The $2,500 fine disappeared, along with many others that had been unjustly handed out. The neighborhood slowly shifted from a place of tension and suspicion to one where people felt comfortable again. Looking back, the lesson was clear. Authority should never be abused, and community should mean more than rules and fines. My wife's calm strength and the courage of our neighbors turned what could have been just another ugly HOA story into a turning point. And while Karen's reign ended, what replaced it was far stronger, a neighborhood finally working together instead of living in fear.